At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The old lady who's paying for everything." I stood there for a moment in the lobby of the Grand Harbor Ballroom, the string quartet playing something soft and cheerful behind me, my reflection caught in the tall gilt-framed mirror, as if even it was waiting to see how I would react. The card was heavy cream stock, my name nowhere to be found, just that sentence written in elegant gold calligraphy, deliberate and polished, as though humiliation could be dressed up and passed off as decor. I felt the weight of it in my hand before I pinned it to my navy silk dress, the one I had bought at Nordstrom 3 weeks earlier, because Emily once told me navy made my eyes look brighter. 72 years old, and I was still trying to look nice for my family. I did not gasp. I did not march back to the check-in table. I smiled at the young attendant who had handed it to me, told her everything was lovely, and walked into the reception hall as if that was exactly who I was supposed to be. The ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, round tables dressed in ivory linen, centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus that I had helped select during a tasting appointment Vanessa insisted I attend, but barely acknowledged me at. I had written a check for $85,000 to cover this wedding, the venue, the catering at $120 per plate, the live band, the open bar, even the custom cake flown in from a bakery 2 states away. I told myself it was my gift to Emily, my only granddaughter, a celebration of love and continuity after my husband passed 5 years ago. Harold used to say family was an investment you never regret. I believed that. I still wanted to believe that. As I made my way past tables marked with neat little numbers, I caught a few glances drifting down to my tag, then quickly away. A woman in a pale green dress leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her hand. He gave a tight smile when our eyes met. I took my seat at table 12, not the head table, not even the table near the dance floor, but close enough to see Vanessa across the room, gliding from guest to guest in her tailored champagne-colored gown, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if she were guiding him. My son avoided looking at me. He adjusted his cufflinks, checked his phone, laughed at something someone else said. The same boy who once slipped dandelions in my kitchen drawer because he thought I deserved flowers every day could not seem to meet my eyes now. I folded my hands in my lap and listened to the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, the faint scent of lemon polish on the dance floor. I told myself it was a joke, maybe an unfortunate one, maybe something that had gotten out of hand. But jokes are usually followed by laughter that includes you, not laughter that circles around you. When the MC tapped the microphone and welcomed everyone to celebrate Emily and Carter, he thanked the parents of the bride, the groom's family, the friends who had traveled from out of state. My name was not spoken. I pressed my lips together and kept my posture straight. I had paid for the orchestra tuning their instruments, for the monogram napkins folded beside each plate, for the late-night espresso cart set up near the patio doors. I had paid for the fairy lights strung across the terrace where couples were already taking photographs against the sunset over the marina. And still, here I was, reduced to a title that sounded less like gratitude and more like a role in a play I had never auditioned for. I did not remove the tag. I let it rest against my chest like a quiet declaration. If that was the part they had written for me, I would wear it for now. But I would also remember who signed the check. The band began playing a slow instrumental version of "Can You Feel the Love Tonight" as the bridal party made their entrance, and everyone rose to their feet with glowing phones held high, capturing a moment that would be replayed and filtered and posted before the night was over. I remained seated for half a second longer than everyone else, not because I could not stand, but because I needed that half second to steady myself. The card pinned to my dress felt heavier now, as though the gold lettering had absorbed every whispered comment in the room. Emily looked radiant walking beside her new husband, her lace train floating behind her like something out of a magazine, her smile wide and sincere. When she reached the sweetheart table, she scanned the room, waving at friends from college, blowing a kiss toward her parents, and for a brief instant her eyes passed over me without stopping. I told myself she was overwhelmed, that weddings are storms of light and sound and emotion, and not every glance can land where it should. Dinner was served with careful choreography. White-gloved servers placed plates of filet mignon and roasted asparagus in front of us, refilled water glasses before they were half empty, and addressed each guest with the same polished courtesy. When my plate arrived, the young man setting it down paused for a fraction of a second, reading the tag at my chest before forcing a neutral expression. I thanked him warmly. I have always believed that kindness costs nothing, even when dignity feels expensive. Across the room, Vanessa leaned toward a cluster of women and laughed, her hand brushing lightly against Daniel's sleeve as if to anchor him there. He smiled on cue. I watched him lift his champagne flute during the first toast. Emily's maid of honor spoke about childhood sleepovers and late-night dreams, about loyalty and lifelong friendship. Then Daniel was invited to say a few words. He cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone, and thanked everyone for coming. He thanked Vanessa for organizing such a beautiful evening. He thanked the groom's family for traveling from out of state. He did not thank me. The omission was so clean, it almost impressed me. I felt the air shift slightly at my table, a subtle awareness from the couple seated beside me who had attended church with Harold and me for nearly 20 years. The woman gave my hand a brief squeeze under the tablecloth. I smiled back and lifted my glass when the room did. The champagne tasted crisp and bright, bubbles rising steadily, indifferent to human discomfort. As dessert was served, I remembered the afternoon Vanessa and I met with the venue coordinator. She had insisted on custom place cards, said details mattered. She had flipped through sample fonts while I wrote another check to cover an unexpected floral upgrade. I had assumed the elegance was meant to honor Emily. Now I understood that details can also be instruments. When the cake was cut and applause filled the ballroom, I noticed Vanessa glance in my direction for the first time all evening. Her eyes dropped briefly to the words pinned to my dress, then rose again with a look that was almost triumphant, as if she were confirming that I had accepted the role she assigned me. I did not look away. I held her gaze for a calm, unblinking second before turning back to watch my granddaughter laugh as frosting smudged the edge of her husband's cheek. The room glowed with celebration, with promises and photographs and carefully curated happiness. And yet, beneath the music and the sparkle, something quiet had shifted inside me. I had come here believing I was contributing to a beginning. I was starting to understand that I had also been underwriting my own humiliation. I kept my shoulders straight, my smile measured, my voice steady when I congratulated the newlyweds. I did not leave early. I did not make a scene. I stayed until the band played their final song, because leaving too soon would have made it look like I had been dismissed. I have learned that sometimes the strongest statement is not spoken at all, but saved for the morning after. The next morning, the house felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to decide what the night had meant. I woke before sunrise, a habit I developed during the years Harold commuted downtown and liked his coffee ready by 6. The light coming through the kitchen window was pale and honest, without chandeliers or string lights to soften it. I set a single mug on the counter, poured fresh coffee, and stood there holding it with both hands, letting the warmth steady me. My navy dress hung over the back of a dining chair, where I had left it, the cream card still pinned neatly to the fabric. I had not removed it before bed. I walked over, unfastened the pin carefully, and laid the card flat on the table, as though it were a document that required examination. The lettering looked even more deliberate in daylight. Not a smudge, not a careless stroke. Designed, approved, printed. Details do not happen by accident. I sat down and tried to replay the planning meetings from the past 6 months. The bakery tasting, where Vanessa insisted on imported vanilla. The floral consultation, where she upgraded from standard centerpieces to cascading arrangements, because, in her words, first impressions linger. The final walkthrough of the ballroom, when she adjusted table placements with measured precision. I had assumed her control came from anxiety about perfection. Now I recognized something else in it. Intention. I opened my checkbook drawer and pulled out the duplicate copies I keep for every significant payment. $85,000 for venue and catering, $12,000 for flowers, $7,500 for music and lighting. Each check signed in my study hand. Each one written because I believed generosity strengthens families. I remembered the afternoon Daniel sat at this very table and told me they could not have the wedding they dreamed of without help. He had looked tired, almost embarrassed. Vanessa had stayed mostly silent, letting him speak, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her water glass. I had reached across the table and told them that Emily deserved something beautiful. I never imagined beauty would come with a label attached to my chest. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a photo notification. A professional picture from the reception had already been posted online. Emily and her husband beneath the terrace lights, laughter frozen in a perfect frame.
Vanessa stood just behind them, one hand on Emily's shoulder, smiling as though she had orchestrated joy itself. I enlarged the image and searched the edges of the crowd. There I was, in the background, small but visible, the gold words catching the flash like a quiet headline. I did not feel anger rise the way it might have years ago. What I felt was clarity. Clarity can be colder than anger. I reached for the leather folder Harold and I kept in the study cabinet, the one containing trust documents and beneficiary designations we reviewed every January. He believed in order. He believed in protecting what he built. I ran my fingers over the embossed cover and thought about the difference between giving freely and being reduced to a function. I had been generous. I had not agreed to be diminished. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the stove. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, ordinary life continuing without spectacle. I took another sip of coffee and looked once more at the card lying flat against the wood grain of my table. It no longer felt like an insult meant to wound. It felt like information. Information about how I was seen. And information, when handled carefully, can change outcomes. I folded the card once down the center, not crumpling it, just reducing it to something that fit neatly in my palm, and carried it with me into the study. There are moments when a woman realizes that silence is not surrender, but preparation. This was one of those mornings.
By 10 o'clock that morning, I was seated in the small study Harold once called his command center, the leather chair still creaking the same way it did when he leaned back to review quarterly statements. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar from the bookshelf he built himself 20 years ago. I opened the leather folder and spread the documents across the desk with deliberate care, smoothing each page flat as though I were preparing a formal presentation rather than sitting alone in my own home. The trust was clear. Harold had insisted on clarity. All primary assets were placed under my control upon his passing, with discretionary authority over distributions to our children and future grandchildren. He believed that responsibility should sit with the person who understood the value of a dollar earned slowly, not spent quickly. I remembered the night we signed those papers. We had returned from dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown, both of us aware that time was not infinite. Harold held my hand across the desk and said, "Margaret, promise me you will never let anyone make you feel like an obligation." I promised. At the time, it felt like a distant safeguard, something we would never truly need. I had not connected that promise to a ballroom and a printed card. I ran my finger down the section outlining educational distributions, wedding contributions, discretionary gifts. Nothing required me to give beyond what I believed was wise. Nothing obligated me to fund appearances. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, replaying the subtle shifts over the past few years. The first Thanksgiving after Harold passed, when Vanessa suggested I take the smaller seat at the end of the table because it would be easier for photographs. The Christmas when Daniel mentioned they might refinance their house and casually asked if I would consider co-signing, just in case. The gentle way Vanessa began referring to my contributions as help rather than generosity, as though I were correcting a deficit rather than offering a gift. None of it had felt sharp enough to confront on its own. Together, it formed a pattern. I opened my laptop and logged into my online banking portal, the screen glowing in the dim light of the study. The final installment for the wedding, a vendor balance for post-event services and gratuities, was scheduled to clear within 3 business days. The amount was significant, but manageable. I hovered over the confirmation page, reading the fine print carefully. I have always believed in honoring commitments, but I have also learned that commitments built on false assumptions deserve review. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Vanessa. "Thank you for everything last night. It was perfect." A small heart emoji followed the sentence. I stared at the words, noticing how easily gratitude can be packaged without acknowledgement. There was no mention of the card, no apology, no explanation, just a polished summary, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as intended. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked once more at Harold's signature on the trust documents. The ink had not faded. His confidence in me had not been misplaced. I did not need to raise my voice or defend my dignity in a crowded room. The power had always been here, in quiet clauses and measured authority. I straightened the stack of papers, aligned the edges precisely, and reached for my reading glasses. The decision forming in my mind was not fueled by anger. It was guided by memory and principle. I had funded a celebration of love. I had not agreed to sponsor my own diminishment. Outside the study window, the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the garden Harold once tended with patient hands. I felt something settle inside me. Not bitterness, not regret, but resolve. If they wished to define me by what I paid, then they would soon discover that payment is something a person can choose to stop. At 11:30 that morning, I called the bank and asked to speak with someone in the trust services department.
And when the representative answered in a measured, professional tone, I introduced myself by my full legal name and account number, not because I doubted who I was, but because I wanted to hear it spoken clearly in a setting that still recognized my authority. I explained that I needed to review a pending distribution scheduled to clear within 3 business days and requested that it be placed on temporary hold until further notice. The representative did not question my reasoning. She confirmed my identity, read back the amount, and informed me that as the primary trustee, I had the discretion to amend or delay any outgoing funds. Her voice carried no judgment, only procedure. When she asked whether I would like written confirmation sent to my email, I said yes, please, and thanked her for her assistance. The call lasted less than 7 minutes. I set the phone down gently on Harold's desk and listened to the quiet that followed. It was remarkable how something so significant could occur without raised voices, without confrontation, without anyone else in the room. Authority rarely announces itself. It simply acts. A few minutes later, an email arrived confirming that the final vendor payment for the reception had been suspended pending further instruction. I read the message twice, not out of doubt, but to feel the weight of the shift. For months, I had been writing checks as though generosity were a reflex. Now I had exercised choice. Choice changes posture. I stood, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself another cup of coffee. The garden outside looked unchanged, hydrangeas blooming along the fence line, sunlight resting on the trimmed lawn Harold once mowed every Saturday morning. Yet something inside me had realigned. My phone vibrated again. This time it was Daniel. I watched his name appear on the screen, let it ring twice before answering. His voice carried a forced lightness. He asked how I was feeling after such a beautiful evening. I told him I was well, and asked how the newlyweds were enjoying their first morning as husband and wife. He hesitated, then mentioned that there had been a small issue at the bank. I paused just long enough for the silence to register. I said that I had reviewed some documents this morning and was taking time to ensure that all financial arrangements reflected my understanding. He cleared his throat and said Vanessa had handled most of the logistics. I replied calmly that logistics do not override authorization. The conversation ended politely, but beneath the courtesy I sensed something unfamiliar in his tone, uncertainty. Within an hour, Vanessa called. Her voice was sharper, the pleasantries thinner. She said there must have been a misunderstanding, and assured me that the printed card had been meant as a playful nod to my generosity. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. Who approved the final print layout? There was a brief pause before she answered that she had. I thanked her for clarifying, and told her that I believed it was important for roles to be defined accurately. If I was to be identified solely by what I financed, then I would make careful decisions about what I financed in the future. She attempted a small laugh, but it did not land. After we hung up, I returned to the study and placed the folded card inside the leather folder with the trust documents, not as a token of resentment, but as evidence of context. People reveal themselves in details, and details, once noticed, are difficult to ignore. I sat down at Harold's desk again and began drafting a list of revisions I intended to discuss with our attorney. I did not feel dramatic. I felt precise. There is a difference between reacting and recalibrating. I was no longer reacting to an insult. I was recalibrating the terms under which my generosity would exist.
That afternoon, I drove to the small brick office building where Harold and I had met with our attorney for nearly 3 decades. The same parking space still shaded by a maple tree that had grown taller and fuller since the first time we signed mortgage papers inside. I had called ahead and secured an appointment with Thomas Green, a man who believed in straight lines and clear language. When I stepped into his office, he stood to greet me, his expression warm but attentive, the way it had been the day Harold insisted that I be listed not only as beneficiary, but as decision-maker. I handed him the leather folder without dramatics and sat across from his desk, folding my hands neatly in my lap. He adjusted his glasses and read through the trust provisions, while I explained in measured sentences the events of the previous evening and the conversations that followed. I did not embellish, I did not accuse. I simply described what had occurred and how it had reframed my understanding of certain expectations. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as though confirming that the law was designed precisely for moments like this. When he finished reviewing the documents, he leaned back and reminded me that discretionary authority was not a suggestion, it was a right. If I felt that my contributions were being treated as entitlement rather than gift, I was within my authority to revise distribution schedules, adjust future inheritances, or redirect funds entirely. He spoke in calm, neutral tones, the language of structure rather than emotion. I told him I wished to establish a scholarship fund in Harold's name for local high school seniors pursuing engineering, the field Harold loved and worked in for 40 years. Thomas made a note and asked whether I intended to modify the existing allocations to Daniel and Emily. I said yes, but not out of anger, out of clarity. I wanted future support to be tied to demonstrated respect and responsibility, not assumption.
Thomas drafted preliminary amendments while I watched the pen move across paper, the ink forming new boundaries where old ones had been taken for granted. When he slid the pages toward me for review, I read each line carefully. Words matter, so do signatures. I signed slowly, aware that I was not severing relationships, only redefining them. On my drive home, the late afternoon sun filtered through the windshield, casting long shadows across the dashboard. My phone rang once, then again. I did not answer immediately. When I finally returned the call, Daniel's voice carried tension he did not attempt to hide. He asked whether I had met with Thomas. I confirmed that I had. He said Vanessa was upset and worried about the vendor payment away and any potential embarrassment. I told him embarrassment is a curious thing. It often arrives after actions, not before them. I explained that I had chosen to redirect certain funds in a way that honored Harold's legacy and reflected my current understanding of family dynamics. There was a long silence on the line. He began to say something about misunderstandings and hurt feelings, but I gently reminded him that misunderstandings can be clarified, while patterns require correction. I kept my tone steady, neither sharp nor pleading. I was not negotiating, I was informing. After we ended the call, I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The house looked exactly as it had that morning. The garden still bloomed, the curtains still moved slightly in the breeze from the open window. Yet I felt lighter, not because I had withdrawn money, but because I had reclaimed definition. Generosity without respect is erosion. Authority exercised with calm is restoration. I stepped inside, closed the door quietly behind me, and placed the amended documents in the study drawer. The role assigned to me had been narrow. The position I actually held was far wider, and I had just adjusted the terms accordingly.
2 days after my meeting with Thomas, the first real consequence arrived, not in the form of anger, but in the form of discomfort. Daniel and Vanessa showed up at my front door late in the afternoon, their car pulling into the driveway with a decisiveness that suggested they had rehearsed the conversation on the way over. I watched them through the living room window before opening the door, noting the tension in Daniel's shoulders and the tightness around Vanessa's smile. I invited them in, offered coffee out of habit, and gestured toward the same dining table where so many of our family discussions had taken place over the years. Vanessa declined the coffee. Daniel accepted, but did not drink it. They sat across from me, side by side, united in posture, if not in composure. Vanessa spoke first. She said the vendor had contacted them about the delayed payment and hinted that it reflected poorly on the family. I listened, my hands folded calmly on the table. I asked whether the vendor had been informed that the trustee was reviewing the allocation. She said that was not the point. The point, according to her, was that I had embarrassed them. I let that word settle in the air between us. Embarrassment. I asked gently whether the printed card at the reception had been intended to honor me. Daniel shifted in his seat. Vanessa responded that it was meant to be playful, that everyone knew I had contributed generously, and that highlighting it was a way of showing appreciation. I nodded slowly and said appreciation is usually expressed with gratitude, not labels. Daniel finally met my eyes then, his expression caught between loyalty and realization. He said they had assumed I would understand the humor. I told him humor depends on shared respect. Without it, it becomes something else. The room grew quiet. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street, ordinary life continuing without regard for the tension inside my home. I reached for the folder I had placed discreetly on the sideboard earlier and slid a single sheet of paper toward them. It was a summary of the revised trust allocations, clearly typed, outlining the establishment of the Harold Whitmore Engineering Scholarship and the adjusted future distributions. Vanessa read quickly, her jaw tightening. Daniel read more slowly. I explained that my decision was not punishment, it was alignment. If my role in their lives was to be defined primarily by financial contribution, then my contributions would be directed where they were met with acknowledgement and purpose. I reminded them that Emily's wedding had been fully funded, that no guest had gone unfed, that no light had gone dim. What I had paused was an additional convenience, not a necessity. Vanessa asked whether this meant I no longer trusted them. I answered that trust and clarity are not opposites. Trust grows stronger when expectations are honest. Daniel placed the paper back on the table with careful hands. He said he had not realized how the card might feel. I told him that realization is valuable, but it often arrives after reflection. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown across the table, only measured words and the quiet recognition that something had shifted. When they stood to leave, Vanessa's posture was no longer triumphant. Daniel lingered a moment longer, as if searching for the right sentence. In the end, he simply said he needed time to think. I walked them to the door and wished them a safe drive home. After they left, I returned to the kitchen and washed the untouched coffee cup, watching the water run clear over porcelain. The house remained steady. So did I. For the first time in a long while, I felt that my presence in this family was defined not by what I paid, but by what I chose. And choice, once exercised, has a way of reshaping every conversation that follows.
The following week unfolded more quietly than I expected. There were no dramatic phone calls, no extended messages filled with accusations, only a measured distance that settled between us like early autumn air. I spent my mornings as I always had, watering the garden, organizing the pantry, reviewing mail at the kitchen table where sunlight pooled in a familiar square across the wood. The scholarship paperwork moved forward efficiently. Thomas sent drafts, I reviewed them carefully, and by Friday, the Harold Whitmore Engineering Scholarship was officially registered with a local community foundation. I felt a quiet satisfaction reading the mission statement, knowing that young students who had never heard my name would benefit from something built with intention rather than assumption. That afternoon, Daniel called again, his voice softer than before. He asked if we could meet, just the two of us. I agreed and suggested Sunday lunch at my house. When he arrived, he came alone. He looked older than he had a week earlier, as if reflection had a way of adding years that celebration never does. We sat at the same dining table, plates of roast chicken and green beans between us, the ordinary rhythm of serving and passing dishes restoring a sense of structure to the conversation. He told me he had spoken with Emily and explained the situation in full. Emily had been surprised, even embarrassed, to learn how the card had been presented. She had assumed it was some kind of private joke between Vanessa and the printer. Hearing that, I felt something inside me ease slightly, not because blame had shifted, but because clarity had spread. Daniel admitted that he had allowed small comments and subtle gestures over the years to pass without question, believing they were harmless. He said he did not realize how those moments accumulated. I listened without interruption. I told him that respect does not disappear all at once. It fades in increments, often disguised as humor or efficiency. He nodded slowly, absorbing the words rather than defending against them. After lunch, he helped me clear the table, rinsing plates and placing them carefully in the dishwasher, movements that reminded me of the boy who once insisted on drying dishes just to stand beside me a little longer. Before he left, he asked whether the revisions were permanent. I told him permanence depends on growth. Documents can be amended, so can behavior. I did not promise to reverse anything. I did not threaten to hold it forever. I simply left the possibility open, contingent on demonstrated understanding rather than expectation. That evening, my phone chimed with a message from Emily. She apologized directly, not with excuses, but with sincerity. She said she never intended for me to feel reduced to a role and that she loved me beyond any financial gesture. I read her message twice, feeling the difference between performance and authenticity. I replied that love does not require payment, only presence. I told her I was proud of the woman she had become, and that I hoped her marriage would be built on mutual respect, not convenience. As night settled over the house, I stepped onto the back patio and looked at the garden Harold once tended. The air was cooler, the sky clear, the quiet steady. I thought about the wallroom lights from a week earlier and how bright they had seemed, how temporary. Real illumination, I realized, does not come from chandeliers or string lights. It comes from understanding your worth without needing it announced. I did not feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The role assigned to me had dissolved, replaced by something far more solid. I was not a line item in anyone's budget. I was the steward of what we built. And stewardship requires discernment. The night carried no applause, no music, only the steady sound of crickets in the yard. It was enough.
The weeks that followed did not explode into conflict or dissolve into silence. They settled into something steadier, something more deliberate. Emily and her husband stopped by one Saturday afternoon with a small potted lavender plant as a housewarming gift for their new apartment. She hugged me longer than usual, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. We sat in the living room with iced tea, sunlight filtering through the curtains, and she spoke about adjusting to married life, about learning to share space and decisions. She did not mention money. She did not mention the reception. She simply treated me as her grandmother. That shift alone felt like restoration. Daniel visited more often after that, sometimes alone, sometimes with Vanessa, who remained polite but noticeably measured. She no longer referenced my contributions casually. She no longer framed requests as assumptions. When conversations turned to future plans, she asked rather than implied. I did not rush to amend the trust again. I allowed time to demonstrate whether the recalibration would hold. The scholarship launched quietly that fall. At the first awards ceremony held in the high school auditorium, I sat in the third row while a young student named Marcus Whitfield stepped onto the stage to accept a certificate bearing Harold's name. He spoke about wanting to design bridges one day, about building structures that connect communities. As the audience applauded, I felt a warmth that was entirely different from ballroom lighting. This was not spectacle. It was substance.
After the ceremony, Marcus shook my hand and thanked me with a sincerity that required no embellishment. On the drive home, I thought about the difference between being acknowledged for what you give and being reduced to what you give. One affirms dignity, the other erodes it. Back at the house, I placed the program from the ceremony inside the same leather folder that once held the folded card. The two pieces of paper rested side by side, a quiet contrast between intention and impact. Months later, at a family holiday dinner hosted at Daniel's home, I noticed my place setting carried only my name, Margaret, printed in simple black script. No embellishments, no commentary. Vanessa greeted me at the door with a composed smile and thanked me for coming. She complimented the cranberry pie I brought, not as a formality, but with specific detail about the crust. We sat together at the table, passed dishes, spoke about ordinary things. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic declarations. There was simply a different tone. Respect does not always return with fanfare. Sometimes it returns in the absence of presumption. As the evening wound down and I gathered my coat, Daniel walked me to my car. He thanked me, not for funding anything, but for showing him what boundaries look like when they are set calmly. I told him that love and limits are not enemies. They protect each other. Driving home under a clear winter sky, I felt no need to revisit the ballroom in my mind. The lesson had already been absorbed. I had not raised my voice. I had not created a scene. I had adjusted my terms. And in doing so, I had shifted the way I was seen. I was never the role printed in gold ink. I was the steward of my own worth, and once I chose to act like it, the room changed accordingly.